3 Nuclear Weapons and North Korea. Here we go. We're starting off with a graph that I thought was applicable because we see the history of North Korea and its using of nuclear weapons through 2019, and we can refer back to this as we move throughout the rest of the video. Let's take a look at the history of Korea and North Korea and see if better understanding that can give us some insight as to why North Korea's nuclear situation is the way it is today. The reading starts by making note of a couple of invasions that happened to Korea. The first was an invasion by China, the second being the Japanese invasion that occurred prior to World War II. It's important to note that a country whose policy is isolationist has a mindset that it wants to have little, if no, involvement with other countries. So could these invasions, could Japanese colonialism, could these be reasons why North Korea has an isolationist policy such as the one it has today? Moving forward, after World War II, Japan is removed, and it's important to note that Japan is removed, and the two main influences removing Japan is the Soviet Union coming in from the north and the United States coming in from the south. The two big world powers that come out of World War II. So it has a communism influence in the north and a capitalist influence in the south. What's also important to note then is the background of Kim Il-sung. So we know that he becomes the leader of North Korea and does so for a long time, but he has spent time in the Soviet Union and China, so he also has this communist background. So the North being influenced by communism, along with Kim Il-sung's background, makes for good reason as to why North Korea ends up accepting or adopting communism. The Korean War starts because of Kim Il-sung's interest in reuniting North and South Korea. The problem he runs into is Cold War politics. Soviet Union is in the north, the United States is in the south, and certainly at this time the United States has no interest in communism expanding. Keep in mind, during this time, the United States is dealing with the Red Scare domestically. What is important to note about the Korean War would simply be, for our purposes, the United States is fighting a war against North Korea, against Kim Il-sung, against China, essentially because of their participation and because of the communism involvement, because they are fighting against the Soviet Union, in a sense. Beyond that, what's important to make note of for North Korea in particular is the economic prosperity that takes place after the Korean War. For a couple of decades, North Korea is well off. Despite it being a repressive state where some individual freedoms are lacking, freedom of the press is definitely not there, and there's only one party. So Kim Il-sung is in charge. There's no threat to him losing it. Economically speaking, people are well off, and the same cannot be said for South Korea. That economic success experienced by North Koreans after the Korean War for a couple of decades might have helped or been a factor in Kim Il-sung gaining such popular notoriety despite the fact that he has a repressive state during his 40-plus year reign. Before moving forward, I think it's important to note that Kim Il-sung has a very close relationship with the Soviet Union, which is a nuclear weapons holding nation, And South Korea is an ally with a nuclear weapons holding nation and enemy of the Soviet Union, that country being the United States. I think that's important to note as we move forward with North Korea and its timeline for gaining nuclear power. Moving forward, let's take a look at North Korea and its nuclear aspirations by highlighting some things on the timeline that the reading takes you through. We'll just mention that in 1985, North Korea signs the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And if you think about what it means for a country to sign this, it does give an indication that a country has a lack of interest in pursuing nuclear weapons. So store that in your head for a moment. In 2002, George W. Bush makes the axis of evil comment. He's referring to countries that have maybe nuclear ambitions and the wrong type of nuclear ambitions they shouldn't have. So those three countries are Iran, Iraq, and North Korea. Part of the reason he makes this comment is because 9/11 recently occurred, and the United States has concerns of countries that have nuclear interests giving weapons to terrorists. So that's the basis behind the comment, but the result of the comment is substantial. North Korea is going to shortly thereafter leave the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And if you think back to what I said about countries signing the NPT, then we can also make a guess or presume that a country leaving the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty might be a signal that they have renewed interest in going after nuclear weapons. In 2006, we have a different type of turning point. North Korea, despite the fact that their tests may not have been an overwhelming success, are starting to display real significant gains in their nuclear program. So that's a big issue for the United States and a big concern, rather, for the United States. Certainly a big turning point in the progress of North Korea's nuclear ambitions. And the third turning point we'll mention will actually take us back to the chart at the beginning of the video. The death of Kim Jong-il in 2011 introduces Kim Jong-un to the world as the new leader of North Korea, a very young person who very little is known about by U.S. intelligence. And there's an uncertainty as to what that means for North Korea and essentially the world. But now, if we look in the rearview mirror for almost a decade, we start to see the nuclear ambitions of Kim Jong-un apparently be maybe greater, or he is continuing the same type of course that his father was continuing. So that's the third turning point that we can look at, pay attention to on this timeline. So how have countries across the world reacted to North Korea's nuclear ambitions? And it's a little bit difficult to get a sense of how a country should, because isolationist policies have countries not wanting to interact with other nations. So what are the incentives for North Korea's buildup? And it's a very difficult thing to figure out, which leads to a lot of different types of responses, most of which have not been very successful. Some of those responses have been economic sanctions. There's been bargaining, which in the end has led to appeasement. The United Nations has been involved. They've also put sanctions on. Most of the time, those have not gone over well because of the UN's struggle to enforce any type of sanctions. Sometimes other countries are actively engaging in diplomacy with North Korea. Then there are times that countries are not. Let's go beyond the reading and take a look at North Korea and the United States relationship today. So, in recent years, under the Trump administration, diplomacy has come back and the two countries have negotiated. In 2018, the talks of the two leaders getting together started to snowball, and then eventually they did have a few meetings. Ultimately, nothing came out of those meetings, and there could be possibly more meetings in the future, but realistically, again, nothing has happened and nothing is out there that suggests that there's going to be any type of progress from the United States standpoint where North Korea cuts down on its nuclear program. If we go back to the chart at the start of the video, we'll see that there's no nuclear tests in 2018. And this is an interesting piece from a political standpoint, because what Trump's argument is going to be is his conversations, his talking, his willing to hear out Kim Jong-un is the reason for so few nuclear tests. If that's the case, though, then in 2019, we see that there are a whole lot more tests done, and that would really signify that now something has gone wrong with the Trump negotiations and diplomacy with North Korea. That type of political thinking is very United States centric and may have us overlook some potential other reasons, such as North Korea's nuclear program has been very much about research and development. But what if they're now at a stage where they're moving into something like mass production and moving beyond research and development? That could be a reason why in 2018 there were so few tests, and then we see an uptick in tests the following year and possibly in 2020. What are the lessons that we can take away from the reading? One lesson could be appeasement. Back in 1994, the United States and North Korea signed the agreed framework, which in it said the United States would go ahead and help North Korea build some nuclear reactors that could not produce nuclear weapons, under the assumption that North Korea would shut down the construction of one in their country that would. Years later, though, it was discovered that North Korea went ahead and continued to build reactors that would be able to produce nuclear weapons. So appeasement is something that is happening with North Korea time and again. However, it isn't to say that something from a war-like perspective needs to take place, but it does remind us of how difficult it is to get an assessment of what exactly North Korea is trying to accomplish with its nuclear weapons program. That's another lesson that we can take away as well. That's it for the nuclear weapons unit, and hopefully I'll see you soon. Bye.